It is a great pleasure to have Tony Atyeo addressing us on the history of veterinary science in Gawler. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks everybody for the invitation to address you tonight. I remember quite a number of years ago I was asked to be a guest speaker at a Rotary Club in Edwardstown, and my topic was the life of a veterinary surgeon. I was asked to present that talk by one of my clients from the mid-north, and I was looked after on that night by a surgeon from the Flinders Medical Centre who was a member of the club, and he was a little bit put out by the fact that I could call myself doctor, and he didn't really think that vets should be called doctors, which we've had the privilege of calling ourselves for a number of years. So he had several digs at me, or through me to the rest of the club that night, suggesting that vets were, glorified animal medicals, or whatever you like to call it. And after a couple of these, I stood up and had a go back at him, all in good fun, of course. But I reminded him that when we vet something, we give it legitimacy, and when we doctor something, it's reprehensible conduct. I didn't hear any more from him for the rest of the night, and got loud applause from the rest of the audience. So I think generally the veterinary profession is seen as a noble one and generally held in high esteem by the general public, and I'd like to think that forever it stays that way. I'd like to, before I talk about the veterinary practice, or call it veterinary services, I'd like to just give you a bit of background on the veterinary profession in South Australia. And what I'm about to say, I thank Bruce very much for, because a lot of it is his work that I'm quoting from. It was written quite a number of years ago, but I don't think Bruce would have forgotten any word that he wrote. So forgive me, Bruce, if I get things wrong. It's just me reading it wrong, not you writing it wrong. After the war, or before the war, and particularly after the war, there was a very grave shortage of veterinary expertise in South Australia, and I think generally in Australia. There are sprinklings of qualified vets that have come through and been present in South Australia, but not in large numbers. And in 1935, they developed the Veterinary Surgeons Act in South Australia, which was to recognise those who could participate as veterinarians or provide veterinary services. And this bill provided for three classes of registration of people. Firstly, people over the age of 21, of good standing and good fame and character, who held a degree in veterinary science. And at that stage, I think the University of Sydney was the only course available in Australia. Also allowed to have registration was a person already practicing for at least 5 years in South Australia as a sole or substantial source of their livelihood. And the third group was termed veterinary practitioners, where the person was a qualified stock inspector or had been employed by a veterinary lodge for less than 5 years. So there weren't terribly many graduates from university or graduates from pure veterinary courses. In 1938, they realised that they weren't getting enough people qualified to perform veterinary services in the state. So they added a further classification, which was called a veterinary permit holder. It was based on the fact that not enough persons in the state had qualified to practice as veterinary surgeons, and they needed more. So they brought in this fourth qualification, which is a veterinary practitioner. They were permit holders, and a permit will be limited in its effect to an area fixed by the board and specified in the permit. A permit or any renewal thereof will not include any area within 25 miles of the residence of a registered veterinary surgeon or practitioner. So these permit holders were allowed to fill the gaps. And this worked for a while. This filled in the gaps. Some of their expertise was questionable, but it was better than nothing. As a result of the shortage of veterinary surgeons following the war, the South Australian government introduced a scholarship system where they were awarding scholarships to people to go to Sydney University to get their veterinary degree, and it was a government scholarship, and the proviso was that they came back to work in South Australia for a period of 3 years as tied to the government. An important change occurred in late 1950 when the government permitted a number of scholarship holders to enter private practice, providing it was in the rural area, so rural practice. The first of these was Rex Butterfield, who opened a practice in Charleston, near Oakbank, and then 12 months later was permitted. He started in Charleston and later moved to Oakbank and continued a veterinary practice there. Just happens that Rex Butterfield was my anatomy professor when I went to university in 1968, and he fondly remembers his time in the Oakbank area. Also, one of the scholarship holders who was permitted to practice was Bruce Eastick, who was given leave from his cadetship or his scholarship and was allowed to open a practice in Gawler. And that was in 1951. At the end of 51, this relaxation was a bit of a boom for veterinary practice. There were a number of people who were given relaxation of their scholarships, and they opened a number of practices in rural South Australia. The first arrangement, the reason for this relaxation followed on industry offering assistance to veterinarians to provide a service to their clients. So there was an arrangement in 1947 which saw Bob Mitten join with the Jacobs Dairy Factory to provide service to the dairy farmers. And there were others who went into practice, one in Victor Harbour and other places. The provision of veterinarians into the country areas, into rural practice, was the beginning really of rural veterinary practices, and Bruce was one of the first. When Bruce opened his practice in Gawler, I think he was the only registered qualified veterinary surgeon north of Jeffs Cross. And I think at that stage was expected to cover all of South Australia and some of the Northern Territory. So the scene has changed dramatically since 1936. A significant development in the early 50s was a release from the Department of Agriculture for rural practices to participate in tuberculosis testing of cattle. And that was particularly important with the milk board, so that we had TB-free milk, and also the vaccination of cattle for contagious abortion. So the rural practitioners, the rural practices had the option of taking up government contracts for TB testing, blood testing and vaccination of cattle. This really did expand the program for rural practitioners, made their practices viable, and allowed them to grow, and allowed more practices to develop into the rural areas. By the early 60s, such was the demand for additional practitioners that the Australian universities couldn't keep up. So a considerable number of New Zealand graduates came to South Australia to fill the gaps. And two of these graduates from New Zealand, who both happened to go to Sydney University anyway, two of these came to work with Bruce in the Williston practice. Some of you may remember Bill Hayward, and others may remember Dick Allen, who were both long-term practitioners in Bruce's practice. Eventually the department allowed senior practitioners to negotiate values for cattle and pigs where specific and notifiable diseases were awarded compensation. So rather than the stock inspectors valuing, the veterinary practitioners had the job as well, which then also helped to make their practices more viable. The other areas where vaccination programs were associated were poultry. The overseas live sheep trade got underway, so anthrax vaccinations were occurring. That's in the early days. So we get to a stage in the mid-50s, early 60s, where rural practice has started to develop and establish itself, and it's quite a viable thing. And Bill Hayward joined Bruce, I think, in 1963, and I think Dick Allen joined him a year later or thereabouts. And both of them spent a large amount of time in the practice. A lot of the scholarship holders that were awarded, or those awarded scholarships for Sydney University, were actually Roseworthy graduates, Bruce being one of these, and a number of others who went away, did their degrees, and came back to South Australia and were able to open rural practices in South Australia. The other thing that happened in the 60s was an increased demand for companion animal veterinarians, dogs, cats and other pets. The influx of migrants from the UK and Europe brought with it a pet ownership mentality, which changed the face of veterinary practice in South Australia. There was a changing attitude to pet ownership. Post-war affluence and increased urbanisation saw great changes in the whole of society, and there's much greater demand for those of us who could treat and manage pet cats, pet dogs and others. Particularly the establishment of Elizabeth changed the population demographics and really did introduce pet ownership in a large amount to the local area. The other thing which started to improve or increase in the 60s was the introduction of intensive animal production. So pigs, poultry, feedlot cattle. And at later days, the introduction of novel animals such as Angora goats, imported cattle breeds, ostriches, alpacas, emus and the rest, that all people thought there was a gold mine in them and wanted to get in on them, and it changed the face. I think alpacas are probably the ones that have kept the dream alive. Most of the Angora goats have left the area, and ostriches, I don't think we see too many of those in the veterinary field anymore. I think they went with Noah. The other thing that happened a little bit later was the shift from small dairy herds to large herds, which have changed the industry considerably. I think the industry realised that this area wasn't really suited to large dairies. I joined the practice in 1973, and at that time we had 200 dairies, registered dairies, on our books that we used to service for government contracts. Now that was a fairly large area. That went, to Kersbrook, to up through the mid-north, out through Mount Pleasant and all through the Barossa. But we had 200 dairies that we had to service for blood testing, TB testing, and also strain 19 brucellosis vaccination. I think, I don't know for sure because I haven't been in the industry for such a long time, but I don't think there's too many left. Maybe 2 or 3 recognised dairies in that same area at this time. So that's just a little bit on the early history and a bit of a background as to how it all started. The early days of the practice, when Bruce was released from his contract of his scholarship and given permission to open a veterinary practice in Gawler, at the end of 1951, I think he was a week early or something like that. He wasn't quite registered before he started to earn money as he settled at Cockatoo Valley or Sandy Creek, and moved into Gawler when a suitable site was available. And that suitable site is where the practice is situated today. So we're looking at 66 years of continuous veterinary care and veterinary service on that site. He employed, and Dawn was his wife was the backbone of the practice. How she raised 4 kids and looked after Bruce and answered the phone and did everything else while he tore himself to pieces working. So hard work, a lot of back-breaking work, but he was young then, and here he is still with us. So never hurt anybody, did it, Bruce? Over the period, he employed several locums and assistants over subsequent years. I don't have records of who they were, but I'm not going to ask Bruce to stand up and name them all from 1952 to 63. He probably could if I really asked him to, but I don't think I would.
And their phone numbers.
In 1963, as I mentioned, he secured the services of Bill Haber from New Zealand, and Bill came out here with his wife, who was an Australian girl from Queensland, and I'm not too sure how many kids he had at the time. I believe he had 4 when he arrived, something like that. The following year, a classmate of Bill, Dick Allen, joined them, and then it was 3. Bill was an avid golfer and a long-term member of the Sandy Creek Golf Club. He served a long term as president, and his particular interest in the animal world was horse medicine. He served for many years as an official vet at the local race meetings and the Gawler Trotting Club, and he was very popular with the local horse community, both in performance and leisure horses. The practice vets were the official veterinarians for the Gawler 3-day event over many years, so not too sure what year that started, but we were in on the ground floor when that was established. In fact, we were the only vets in town at the time. That event culminated in the World Championships in 1986, and that was the pinnacle of Gawler's inclusion in the 3-day eventing. In that 1986 event, I was asked to serve as the official treating veterinarian for the complete event, so I was required to be on site whenever there were horses in action. So it was a pretty long weekend, but lots of fun. I was also somehow seconded to the Irish team as their official veterinarian. They didn't have a very big team, they weren't terribly successful, but they were here for a good time. So the only drawback to that was that I found out after the event had started and I was in, almost at the end of it, that my services were to be donated to the Irish team. So all the drugs and x-rays and everything else that I provided were out of my pocket. Anyway, it was good fun, but that wasn't the only thing given away free for the 3-day of the World Championships. Dick Allen was a member of the local Lions Club and was involved in a number of community organisations, and both men went on to join Bruce in partnership in the practice. And at that time the business was known as Bruce C. Eastick and Partners. Now at that point the focus was on large animal practice, and small animal work just seemed to be a second cousin in those early days. Dick had a great interest in intensive animal production, particularly pig farming, and some of you may remember Intensive Industries and Tom Brinkworth at Gawler River. Dick was involved in the early days with that enterprise and went through with them, I think, for their Wasleys and all their, I think, 3 or 4 different piggeries that they established. He also had all-round skills in large animal and companion animals as well. The arrangement with Bruce and his partners continued until, I think it was 1970, when Bruce was elected to Parliament and subsequently to the leadership of the opposition Liberal Party, at which time Bruce needed to stop his veterinary work and concentrate on his parliamentary duties. I joined the practice in early 1973 after graduation from Sydney at the end of 1972. Now, if you do your sums, you'll realise that I have never ever worked with Bruce as a fully qualified veterinarian. I've known Bruce since I was in high school. He used to be our vet for our horses in Balaclava, and I was pretty keen on being a vet from the age of 13, so Bruce Eastick and Partners Veterinary Clinic saw a lot of me during my high school years, and then saw a fair bit of me during my university career as well. Bruce practiced as a vet from 1952 to 1971, which according to me is 19 years. I've just clocked up 45 years in the same job from 1973 to the current year. I don't know whether it's insanity or just that I like the work I do. Williston remained the base for the practice, but Bruce developed a branch clinic at Elizabeth Grove in the early 60s, which served a small animal clinical base only. It was serviced by the vets from Williston on a 6 days a week basis, but not on a full-time basis. This clinic was closed in 1993 when we transferred our services to Smithfield on a 6 days a week basis, but increased the hours of attendance. And at that stage it was still only a small animal practice. In 2002 we further extended the business when the Tanunda Vet Clinic was purchased from Malcolm Anderson, who had established the practice 10 years earlier. This was small animal practice only, and we made the decision at that time that we could no longer service the farm and equine market due to many factors. One of the issues that we dealt with in those days was that very few, if any, of the new graduates wanted to work in large animal rural practice. They didn't like the idea of having to be on call 7 days a week or share an on-call emergency service. They wanted to work a 9 to 5 and didn't want the responsibility of working by themselves on cold, wet nights in the middle of winter. So they also saw Gawler as a country area and they all, most of them wanted an urban environment. I remember one year before we gave up the large animal work, I interviewed 23 veterinarians for one job over a period of 12 months, and as soon as I mentioned the fact that you'll have to do some after hours work and you have to do some weekend work and you have to do some farm work, they walked out the door. They just couldn't get anybody to recognise that it was a noble profession. The other factor at that time was that South Australia was the only state that didn't have a veterinary school. and a lot of the new graduates couldn't see themselves surviving in practice without a vet school to refer to or to ask advice of. They didn't think that the principals or the senior veterinarians in their practices would know enough to be able to help them get through their day. They thought they had to have a vet school to refer to in order to survive. So we got there and we still survived. Now in 1975, just a couple of years after I joined, Bruce sold his share of the practice to Bill and Dick, who then offered me a partnership which I accepted. We were then known as Hayward, Allen and Atyeo, and later to become Hayward and Atyeo, then morphed into Gawler Veterinary Services as it is today. There was a practice opened at Kapunda in the late 60s, which was a joint partnership between the Gawler partners and David Jones, who had been employed initially by the practice to handle the Kapunda practice. He worked there independently for a number of years, and then David bought the remaining share of Kapunda in the same year that the whole place was restructured. I was the recipient of a Department of Agriculture cadetship to do my university career, but it only bound me to work in South Australia for 5 years or pay back the money. I didn't have to work for the government, and I didn't need permission to go into rural practice. I was interested in mixed practice and was familiar with the practice and the people in it. I had spent a number of work placements there during my university career. So they offered me a job at the end of my 4th year, so I had the whole of my final year knowing that when I finished all I had to do was pass and I had a job. I didn't have to worry about where I was going to go to work. Made it fairly stress-free. But the workplace, the veterinary profession in those days, there were jobs everywhere and you could pick and choose whichever one you wanted. Opportunities everywhere, including overseas. You could go spend a year in Australia and go and get a good job in the UK or elsewhere. So it wasn't as though I had nowhere else to go, but I had to work in South Australia. By the time my 5 years was up, I'd been a partner in business for 2.5 years. I was married with 2 kids and fairly entrenched in the business, so I didn't really have anywhere to go. I had to stick around and decided to anyway. The business progressed over the years to rely less on the farm and equine income and more on small animal. In 1981, we built a new clinic and hospital on our current site with lots of what were then modern facilities. It's now looking pretty old and tired, and as a consequence we're in an advanced stage of establishing a new site on Redbanks Road at the old CFS site. So we're hoping to move into that. It's being constructed at the moment. We're hoping to move into that within a couple of months' time. Very exciting. Dick Allen, one of the partners, died suddenly in 1983 at the age of 49, which is a bit of a wake-up call to Bill and I, because we thought part of that was because he worked so hard, and so did we. So from that point, Bill and I then employed assistants over the subsequent years until Bill retired in July '96. I have never in my whole time seen anybody time his retirement to the day. By the time June the 30th came along in 1996, he was absolutely ready to give it up. He loved it till he stopped, but he never ever looked to go back to it. He said to me a little bit before he retired, "If you want me to come back and give you a hand if you get stuck, I will, but I don't want to do it." And I promised him I wouldn't, and I never did. Yes, Bill absolutely loved his retirement. He went on golf trips and he was having a ball. I've never seen him as happy as when he was retired, never seen him as well. Tragically, he only enjoyed a short retirement because he died of cancer about 15 months later. There haven't been any more partners into the business since '96. As we had before, I continued to employ assistants to get the work done. There's a lot of comment in the business that you shouldn't take on partners because it's all too hard. Bruce had partnerships with Bill and Dick, and I think that was very successful. I was in partnership with Bill and Dick, and it worked well for us, but I was never going to offer it to anybody else because I don't think it could have done it as well as we did. And Bill was of the same opinion once Dick had died that no, we won't change our partnership. We'll go and employ assistants, which is what we're doing to now. There have been many stories to come out of the many associate vets employed over the years. Bruce would have a few, but I won't ask him to talk about those. I've seen some brilliant young graduates come and work for me, and I've seen young vets who maybe should not have chosen the veterinary field to work in. Not everybody who comes out of university has the talent for it. Most do, but there are, like every profession, every walk of life and every job, there are some who just aren't suited. Of course, there are many in between these extremes. Some just didn't have the talent. Some didn't realise what they were getting into. They didn't realise the hours and dedication needed. Some didn't respond well to the hard and long days, which are part of every day. When Bill Hayward retired, I had employed a young graduate from Queensland who started about March before, so we had a transition period where we tried to get her up to speed and get her working efficiently and at least standing on her own 2 feet, once Bill had retired. Bill retired on the 30th of June and she resigned on July the 7th because she couldn't stand the pressure of the responsibility of looking after things without somebody else with her. She just couldn't stand it. That put a little bit of cat among the pigeons a bit, but we got there. One of the issues, I think, with the lifestyle in those days was it's terribly different to today. The onus on us as workers was very demanding. We had long days. It was regular that we would get an early morning call just after dawn to a milk fever case or a difficult calving in the middle of a paddock. We'd get that out of the way and then go home, have a shower and get ready for the day's work. If you happened to be on call that day, you could bet that at 5 o'clock when everybody else knocked off, the phone call would come from the local dairy farmer who just has brought his cows in for milking and realised that one of them's having trouble calving, or it's a couple down with milk fever and you need it there straight away. It was always 5 o'clock, well about 5:05 when the phone rang. Never 3 o'clock when someone else could do it with you. Or you might get a case of horse colic. For those who don't know what colic is in a horse, it's a horrible guts ache and can be very, John knows all about that. Can be very dramatic and sometimes fatal. It's an emergency call. As I said, the work was demanding and challenging, and we needed to be resilient and instinctive and enterprising. Most of the scenarios we came across were never taught at university. They told us what might happen, but it was up to us to work out a way to make it happen. They never told us how you managed to deliver a calf from a cow at the bottom of the hill. The cows become weak, walk down the hill, can't get out, finishes up in a creek at the bottom of the hill, and can't deliver a calf. So we find a way to do it. Of course, in those circumstances, you can't reach the cow with your vehicle because it's too wet. So you have to get it right on the back of a tractor, take all your gear with you. Good fun, not while it's happening, but you have a bit of a laugh and pat yourself on the back when you get a good result. I remember, it's amazing some of the things you do remember. Normally they're not really good times. I remember one occasion where I attended a late night difficult carving in the middle of winter at Williamstown, so a cold, wet, wintry. Luckily it was in a dairy. And after I'd done that, I had to attend to a valuable horse with colic at a place called Willamurra Stud at Kersbrook. Some of you may remember Willamurra, the quarter horse stud. I got to the horse stud, but suffering quite badly from hypothermia, so they had to warm me up with blankets and hot drinks and fire before I could attend to their horse. Some things you never forget and don't wish to repeat. I've seen a few funny things happen to some of the graduates, the new graduates that I've employed. I sent one young vet out one day to collect blood samples from a herd of goats at McDonald Park. I expected it would take him about an hour, and 3 hours later he returned with three of the 20 samples he was expected to collect. He couldn't understand why I was upset. I couldn't understand how it took him so long, and he couldn't explain why it took him so long. When I told him that I expected a faster work rate, he got offended and resigned, and I didn't try and talk him out of it. Many people in the early days of my career were of the opinion that veterinary work was not for the female gender, and they thought that men were best suited to the profession. I even today get that sort of comment about, how do girls do the hard work, the heavy work that needs to be done. In my graduation class we had 15% female graduates, all of whom were very skilled and committed veterinarians. In fact, more so than some of the men. The women tended to take it very seriously. They were absolutely committed to doing the best job they possibly could. Some of the men couldn't care less. They knew they were going to get a job and it didn't really matter to them. In today's veterinary demographic, there are over 80% females in most year levels. Sydney University a few years ago had a 100% female cohort in one of its years. The job has changed. It's not this. I keep telling people that I've worked in the same veterinary practice for however many years it is, but I haven't had the same job all that time. I just happen to work in the same building. The job really has changed. In fact, it changes almost daily. In 1973, on my arrival, the Gawler area was essentially dependent on the rural sector, but that's all changed since then. Our workload was primarily farm animals and performance horses, at about 80% of our caseload, and companion animals, dogs and cats, about 20%. Facilities were quite primitive. We didn't have any fancy buildings, fancy equipment. We did what we possibly could. We were the officiating vets at the Gawler Trotting Club and the Gawler and Barossa Jockey Club. We were offered the position at the Gawler Greyhounds before I arrived, but it was declined because the vets at the time knew about horses but had no interest in greyhounds, to my understanding. Our equipment was very basic, and I guess many of you will remember the television and books, All Creatures Great and Small. That was on television at the very time I came to Gawler, and it was very, very realistic. I could sit in the chair and watch an episode and put my own names to the characters in that TV program and I'd substitute my clients for the people in the show. It was very realistic. I actually visited Yorkshire in 2002 and visited Harriet country in the town of Thirsk in Yorkshire. I made myself known, there wasn't very many people there, I made myself known to the lady sitting at the front desk and said, I'm a vet from Australia. And the museum was in the original home and practice of Alf White, who was the author. And I was given a personal tour of the place, taken up to the top museum and shown all the places and given a bit of a background that nobody else was given on their normal tour. What disturbed me mostly about the upstairs room was they had on show all the instruments from James Herriot and Ralph White's veterinary days, all shiny and in their cases, and I could name them all, which really did date me. And the other thing that worried me was that I knew how to use a lot of them too. And these were old instruments that weren't in current use. The facilities on local farms were varied and in some cases not at all. It was not unusual to arrive to tend a cow in trouble calving to find her in the middle of the paddock running around quite happily, not tethered and persistently escaping the efforts of the farmer to restrain her. And when questioned, why didn't you catch her? Well, what do you expect me to do? They said, well, you're the vet, you should know how to handle this. And the normal response was to hop in the car and drive back and say, call me when you're ready. The poor facilities in many of these places meant that we had to be quick on our feet and have our wits about us or run the risk of getting really badly hurt. And it's part of the job we did. I was trampled by an angry cow and kicked by a number of reluctant horses, but not very often. As mentioned earlier, the work slowly shifted to companion animals, which meant a need for greater sophistication in services. We continued to provide a 24/7 service for emergency cases, both large animals and small. We had a primitive phone system, which Bruce would remember, which relied on the vet on call answering all incoming calls for both business and calls for the other families. I can't quite remember the name of the system it was, but we all had the same phone number, so if anybody wanted to ring me or my family, they went through the business number, and whoever was manning the phones at the time would take the call and transfer you to that extension. Now, that was as good a facility as we had in those days. We didn't have mobile phones, and it was difficult to have your own phone number and divert them effectively, so it became a bit of a problem. So we all had to answer calls for each other, and if the vet was on a job, the wife had the job of answering the phone. This, if this was today's world, that would be a recipe for a quick divorce. It wouldn't be tolerated. In fact, the vets themselves wouldn't like it either. The concession to fielding everybody else's calls that we were not expected to take family calls after 10 p.m. This was problematic with the other families in my time. They had teenage sons and daughters whose social life took preference over minor inconveniences like waking me up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to try and find out where their friends were. We survived. As the pet owning public was prepared to spend more on their pets, the demand on the profession increased to provide a higher level of expertise than ever before. In early days, there was no access to specialists, and we had to do what we could with what little resources we had at our disposal. The pet owning public didn't expect a lot of us. They knew that we were doing as best we could. We didn't have highly trained nurses, but they were often highly skilled from learning on the job. The veterinary nurse training certificate was commenced in around about 1975 at the Panorama TAFE, amid lots of opposition from the vets, as they thought higher qualifications would mean higher wages, and they would opt to train them in-house. A lot of them said, I refuse to employ your trained veterinary nurses because I don't believe in it. Eventually, the recognition of nursing skills and advanced training has become the norm in veterinary practice, and it's very unusual for any nurse to have high expectations or high levels of responsibility in practice without having their certificate for. As I mentioned earlier, the job changes every day, and we are learning something by the hour. Every day there's something new coming on. We're regularly made aware of new diseases and complaints, and this has been a feature all through my career. Many of you will know or have heard about the disease parvovirus in dogs. That's a disease that has established since I graduated. That was a new disease in the late 70s, and I can still remember my first case. They introduced a virus in rabbits called calicivirus, and I remember my first case of calicivirus in a domestic pet. I remember the discovery of feline immunodeficiency virus, or cat AIDS, which is a new disease. Almost daily we have new drugs coming on the market. We have new vaccines, we have new laboratory tests. The use of laboratory standby tests in my early days was almost non-existent. Now it's the norm for veterinary practice to have their testing facilities in-house. They do a lot of them themselves. When I graduated, I didn't know what an ultrasound was. Now I've taught myself how to use one and interpret results. CT scans and MRI scans are all the norm now. Roseworthy's got one, Two Wells have got one. Almost any large practice is establishing CT scans, and one of the practices in Adelaide is about to put in an MRI. One of the confusing things for me are the new names for the diseases that I've been seeing for years, but I keep using the old names for these diseases and confusing the younger generation. And the same for the new bacteria and viruses that we've always known as so-and-so. They've all got new names now, and some of them have changed 3 or 4 times since I graduated. So there's a bit of confusion there. Many of you will probably remember the use of ether as an anaesthetic. It's never used anymore. We don't use barbiturates anymore for anaesthesia. There's far safer drugs on the market. We have safer machines, safer anaesthetic machines, safer monitors. And our standards of care are expected to include all this new equipment and these new drugs and procedures. We can't survive and can't justify our ability to practice safe veterinary medicine without adopting the new standards. One of the biggest areas of change that I've noticed over a period of time is the human and animal bond which exists with people and their pets nowadays. And you underestimate it at your peril. These little animals and big animals and anything with legs or no legs sometimes are so important in people's lives, and particularly with elderly people, where sometimes their pet is the only thing worthwhile in their life. We need to be absolutely on the ball in assessing how these people, these clients, love their animals and are prepared to do everything for them. And as a result, we find ourselves constantly as grief counsellors when time comes that these little animals have to go. The clients expect us to deliver a compassionate service in their time of grief. We just need to be aware of the human-animal bond in all aspects, and trying to read the tone of the person's thought is sometimes a very hard thing. What hasn't changed in our profession is the need to have an inquisitive mind, a logical thought process, and a dedication to both client and patient. There's an absolute need to be brave and courageous in your decision making and your attempt to try new things and to adopt new policies. And particularly, there's a great need to be resilient and honest in everyday life. We have a large problem in our profession, and it's been with us for many, many years. In fact, it was talked about in many cases in during my learning, my university days, and that's the suicide in our profession. We still have one of the highest rates of suicide of our veterinary personnel, and have for 50 years. In fact, Stan approached me tonight with that very comment, that it's one of the things that the veterinary profession features highly in suicide statistics. And I can understand where that comes from, because inherently the good operators in our profession are either totally heartless or totally softies, and most of them are softies. It's a particular, mental health is a particular issue amongst our veterinary nurses. They come to work expecting to have a good time and have positive outcomes, have a good, happy, joyful, positive workplace for the day, and sometimes go home totally spent. They're in the firing line every day for those things likely to impact on their mental health. There can be days when multiple cases have poor outcomes, when financial constraints mean no further treatment is possible, where old age means euthanasia, where the owners have little option but to end their suffering. And mental fatigue or compassion burnout is a very strong part of our profession, and as an employer I have to be aware of that every day, be on the lookout for it, and to develop strategies that will help my staff to overcome any tendency to burnout or mental or compassion fatigue. And it's not always easy, and it's not always easy as a boss to understand what my staff are going through, but it is a real part of every day. And we have to spend a lot of time making sure that everything's upbeat and everybody's looked after. I haven't personally had any of my staff in the suicide area or suicide danger, but one of my colleagues from my years at university committed suicide about 5 years ago for no apparent reason, and still don't have an explanation for it. That's probably as far as I go with the practice Gawler Veterinary Services now, but I just probably need to just make a comment on the rest of the veterinary scene in and around Gawler. We've had a number of other practices. Bruce opened his practice in '52. We've had a number of other practices in town. The first, I think, to come was Gawler South. Chris and Shelley Arnold, who actually came to our practice as students and did a placement during their undergraduate years, saw that Gawler was a good space, so when they graduated they came back here and set up an opposition.
No.
That's right. Bill and Sandy Harbison. Bill, of course, was a Gawler boy. John Harbison, the doctor, was his father. They set up an equine clinic on the edge of town. Riverside established, not too sure which year, with Rob and Mandy Oric. When Harbisons sold their practice, that was bought by Hayley and Rebecca French Davis, who then carried on and developed an Animalia clinic. And a few years ago, Kim Sutherland established the Main North Road Clinic in the centre of town. And of course, a lot of this time, the Adelaide Plains Equine Clinic with Elizabeth Herbert was established initially at Lewiston and then moved into Buckfield, I think, or Belt somewhere. And the other big development in the university was at the university with the establishment of the veterinary school, which has been a real, been a real success story. They put out, I think, 4 or 5 years of graduates. Paul, can you get me a drink, please? A great success and a great support for local practices with their specialists and their expertise. Especially with the introduction of equine, their equine centre and their production animal centre and their laboratory. They've got it all, it works well, and they put out a fabulous graduate. And I had particular, I did a little bit of work with their final year students for several years, and was always very impressed by the standard of their graduates. I'm very proud of what the university's achieved and continue to sing their praises. That's probably as far as I want to go tonight. I would love to take questions if you've got any, but there's probably a lot of other things I could have said, but chose not to protect the innocent. I hope Bruce has agreed with maybe more than 50% of what I said. I never let the truth get in the way of a story. But I do thank you for the opportunity of talking to you, and thanks again.
Can I?
What sort of future does the Roseworthy Veterinary University give? Does that put South Australia on the map again in that respect?
It does. I was just commenting earlier that trying to find vets in South Australia at the moment is like finding hen's teeth. Their graduates, I think they're putting 75 out at the end of this year. I think their first output was about 40. And they're all getting snapped up very, very quickly. They're finding jobs all over Australia. I continue to sound their praises because they're equal to any other university graduate that I've ever had the pleasure to deal with. They're outstanding group of people that they produce. And they have a culture there which I think is very healthy in that their teaching is collaborative. Those who are teaching have the right attitude and want to see their students succeed. And the students will honour that commitment by becoming outstanding practitioners. Yes,
what degree do you have to deal with reptiles?
Not very much. There are some of the vets who refuse to go anywhere near them. they run out the door as soon as one comes through the front. I see them occasionally for limited
Sorry,
problems.
what kind of reptiles?
Oh, we're talking about lizards, snakes. We see some amphibians, turtles and things, but pet lizards, pet snakes mainly. Not in large numbers. There are vets in different practices, and also there's a specialist veterinary practice in Richmond and Adelaide who specialise in birds and exotics. And they, in fact, I referred one to them this afternoon, a very sick python. Right.
If you got 5 years of university study, how does a veterinary science degree compare to the general practitioner doctors? I don't totally understand the difference.
We see the same mammal for most of our patients in a different form. So we've all got the same anatomy, or essentially the same anatomy. The bones are all the same, just different shapes. We're just talking about this today, that we have 5 fingers, and the horse has essentially the same anatomy as we do, but they walk on the end of their middle finger. So their anatomy over a period has changed. There's a little bit of difference in the physiology of a lot of the animals. We tend to think that we're better than doctors because doctors have got one species to look after. We have, I think, 6 or 7 major species that we have to know all about. We have dogs, cats, we have birds, we have horses, we have ruminants, cows and sheep and goats and whatever. They're all essentially the same type of species. So we have to be proficient in as many of their diseases and their infections that we possibly can. And the better you are at that, the better job you do. The expectation on us is different, but there's only so far we can go. The medical profession has the beauty of having it all paid for by the government, so there's virtually no restriction on no financial constraints on how far you take a case. I don't know when the last time a GP did any surgery, but we have to be the anaesthetist, the radiologist, the surgeon, the behavioural specialist, the neurologist, the embryologist. We have to be all the ologists that you can list. I think the latest count's about 40 of the ologists that we have to be.
Good grief.
And we have to do it ourselves unless we have the services of a specialist or someone of particular interest in it. So the other drawback we have is that I've never had one of my patients ever talk to me.
All right.
But at the same time, I've never had one lie to me either. So, the secret is to find out what's wrong by listening to the animal or the patient.
I'm glad I asked the question. Tony Jackson.
Geez, thanks, Tony. I found that very fascinating, the whole lot.
Thank you.
Because I'm a retired dentist, and I think that our profession is virtually parallel to yours. So many things I could feel I was you. The adoption of the title doctor, for a start. The adoption of taking in partnerships. The mental suicides. I think we're ahead of you. You might be a second. Did you ever hear of a guy called John Redden?
Jack Redden at Murray Bridge?
John
Redden.
Because he was at my year at high school, and he was going to do veterinary science. I never heard what happened to him.
He finished up owning the Murray Bridge veterinary practice.
That's him. I went to high school with him in year 12.
Yeah. His family was originally from Gawler River, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which high school was he?
Enfield. He went to Enfield with me.
He was a graduate from Roseworthy too, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he originally went to Roseworthy. We always knew him as Jack.
But he said, he had to go to Sydney or Queensland.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I think
it wasn't the school. When did Adelaide open?
Adelaide was 2000 and started at 2010, I think.
And you call him Jack. We always call him John.
Yeah, he's always known as Jack.
Yeah, we call him John.
He's now retired. I'm not too sure where he's living now, but he was a great.
In our year 12 biology, he was one of 3 students who passed biology, 3 out of 24. No, not many passed biology in year 12.
Apart from being a very, very good friend and a very good mate to the profession, I didn't know him on a strongly personal basis, but he was a very good practitioner as well. Yeah.
He was
very highly
dedicated then.
One final question. No?
Well, Tony, obviously,
Stand up, please.
Tony, we've all got our Medicards, Medicare cards, our health benefits and all this sort of thing. It's not a financial burden necessarily to us. What about if we bring our pets to you? Is there any...
We're trying to encourage more people to take up pet insurance, but a lot of people find it quite an onerous burden to afford pet insurance, and some insurers are better than others. But that's about the only way that we can assist or reduce the burden on people. It's difficult in a private business to afford people credit because a large percentage of them will take credit and never pay you. There are facilities for credit companies to take over the payments, and then they collect the money from their client. But it is a daily issue with us, is the costs involved. And the higher the value and the higher the standard of services that people expect, of course, the higher the cost. And there gets a point sometimes where the veterinary surgeons board will not let us do less than a certain standard of work. So in some cases we are expected to provide a higher level of service, or the client is expected to stop the process and have their pets put to sleep, which is always very difficult.
Last question. What's the weirdest pet or animal you've ever had to work on?
Probably a camel.
Camel.
We don't see too many of them around.
Bruce, can I ask you, Bruce, what was the weirdest animal you've ever worked on?
An elephant.
An elephant.
It's one of the wishes for a lot of people. Brian's calling.
No.
Wishes of a lot of people in the undergraduate. They all want to do zoo medicine because it's very glamorous. Not too many of them end up there though.
I'll now ask... no more. No, we're getting too late. I'd like to ask John Schultz to come forward, please, and give the vote of thanks for an excellent address. Give him the microphone, please.
Before I do that, I'd like to say thanks to Brian for asking me. The Schultz family have known the Atyeo family since the mid-1930s, down at Coldie, where Tony's grandfather was share farming for my father. There, so that's the Coldie school is no longer existent like a lot of those places down there. But listening to Tony tonight there took me back to the early days when Bruce started in Gawler, and our association with him, and also with Dick Allen and Bill Hayden. And since we retired into Gawler over 10 years ago now, it's funny to hear those memories of cows that can't calve and horses that have got colicky, and no thanks, I don't think I'll go back that way. But we indeed appreciate your talk tonight, Tony, and have much pleasure in handing you this. And would you all put your hands together? Tony, please bring the